Hey everybody, welcome to week 6. We're making some great progress in the course and we're not wrapping up, we're about halfway through section 2 of the course where we cover the 3 branches of government. Last week we focused on the executive, primarily focusing on the president and expanding that to understand the impact of the bureaucracy and the responsibilities of the bureaucracy and the cabinet. Additionally, looking at the vice presidency and governors. And this week, we're going to expand that discussion to look at the legislative branch, the relationship between the legislative and the executive, and additionally, brief examinations of the relationship between the legislative and judicial. So let's begin. All right, so general learning objectives, just like every week, we're going to look at Congress today. House and Senate, understand the differences between the two bodies, how legislation is created in the United States, how a bill becomes a law upon Capitol Hill, if you know Schoolhouse Rock from back in the day. Interpret the meaning of some dimensions of our Constitution, including the elastic clause, also known as the necessary and proper clause. Looking at one of the tools utilized by the Senate exclusively, referred to as the filibuster, and understanding the impact and evolution of the filibuster over time, exploring some of the constitutional foundations. And then, as we always do, we're going to wrap it up with an examination of the checks and balances and how they operate in regards to restricting the legislative branch. So let's start with overview of the legislative branch at large. What is the structure? So we remember from the beginning of the semester the Great Compromise, which was the agreement in that, the better compromise made at the Constitutional Convention of 1787. We see bicameralism being implemented. This is where we divide the legislative branch into two bodies. We will have the House of Representatives and the Senate. The House of Representatives representing that Virginia plan, and the Senate representing that New Jersey plan. We won't have to remember the specifics of which plan was adapted into which dimensions of these bodies, but it is worth noting that origin of this foundation of bicameralism. So when we look at the structure of the legislative branch, these 3 points right here are to help you visualize the intention of this body, but these are not defining differences. And I will not accept these as answers for the differences between the two bodies on your quizzes or final, as it is not in-depth enough of an examination of the bodies. But when we zoom out and we look at how they operate at large, we see that the House of Representatives is more organized as it has far more members. 435 members, which has been capped since the early 1900s. We see, in comparison to the 100-person Senate, there is a far more greater representation of the will of individuals through ideology or emotion. So you see they represent regional districts. They have to appease to a more specific political identity, where senators have to appeal to their entire state, and more general overarching political identity. And they have longer terms, so they have more of an incentive to act as a long haul mind, I guess you could simply say. They're focused on the greater sentiments and tend to act as a cooler to the House. Traditional political scientists use the analogy of the tea and the teacup, or the plate under your teacup. The saucer. Nobody uses this anymore, but this is how a lot of people will define the differences between the House and the Senate. The House is the teacup with very hot tea that may spill over here and there. The Senate acts as that saucer that will catch the excessive spills of emotion or ideology and tame it with and cool it off, as the tea example would fit. And that acts as a cooler to the general House being more emotionally driven, the Senate being more calmer minded. Of course, when you look at individual representatives, this ebbs and flows and varies based on each representative and their way of acting as either a trustee or a delegate representative, and their prioritizations of security or liberty in times of threat. So we see the structure of the legislative branch being bicameralism. Division of the legislative branch into the House of Representatives and the Senate. The House of Representatives, 435 members, and the Senate with 100. So let's look at the specific powers of Congress. Now, these powers are divided between the House of Representatives and the Senate. We'll explore some of the differences between the two bodies in just a moment. But when we look at the powers of Congress at large, it's important to understand these general responsibilities and powers. So we see the public education function. This is their ability to set the agenda by determining what issues will be discussed and decided upon. Use tools like public hearings, oversight and bureaucracy, committees, floor debates. They do this with issues like immigration, firearms, concerns of small businesses, and so much more, corporate interests. So we see a ability to determine how we will address and examine specific issues. Then we also examine their ability to declare war. Although we have not had Congress officially declare war since World War II, it is also worth noting, I say that too much, that they have expanded congressional powers and oversight over war, specifically the powers of the president through the War Powers Resolution of 1973, in which you required notification to Congress within 48 hours of presidential deployment of troops. In addition to within 60 days, Congress must approve deployments as well, or troops will be sent back home. So we see this their relationship with our influence during times of war still maintaining over time, although constitutionally having greater powers at our onset. Congress can also raise and regulate an army and a navy, ratifies treaties signed by the Senate and by the president. As we remember, the Senate has that responsibility to ratify said treaties. So they do have significant impact, primarily in the Senate, in regards to foreign policy and international relations. Now, another power of Congress is the power to regulate interstate commerce and international trade. Interstate commerce is the trade between states. So we see that it's up to the state legislatures to determine what is legal and sold within their state. The prime example is cannabis legislation. We see in Montana, Idaho, well, not Idaho, Montana, Washington, some other states, I don't know of the states, but they have legalized cannabis. But you cannot distribute those goods across state lines due to the nuances of state policies and the lack of a federal legislative approach to interstate commerce of that good between state lines. So you see, of course, Coca-Cola products are traded between states as we have universal laws for that product, but when there is variances between state legislation with certain goods, federal Congress has a role to determine the regulation of interstate commerce in addition to trade with other nations. We also see Congress has the oversight powers. This is where you would see committee hearings. You would see that the oversight power is intended to make sure Congress has the ability to ensure that legislation is being enforced properly, as they had intended. So they would have hearings pulling in representatives of oftentimes executive department agencies. We see in recent weeks, we saw oversight committee hearings with Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and various other administrative officials, in addition to representatives of the general public. About a year ago, if this was last semester, the example I would be using would be Mark Zuckerberg testifying in front of Congress regarding regulation of social media platforms. You also saw the owner, CEO, or president, one of the representatives of TikTok, answering questions in front of an oversight committee months back. So those are examples of oversight powers. It's the process of following up on laws previously passed by Congress to ensure that they're being enforced and administered as intended, done through committee hearings and investigations aimed at identifying bureaucratic wrongdoings. So we also see they have the power to determine the number and apportionment of federal judges and Supreme Court judges. We do see fluctuations in federal judges throughout the entire nation, while we do not see much movement when it comes to considerations of the number of Supreme Court justices. As we will learn next week, we have 9 Supreme Court justices, which has been capped for quite some time now. Although we did have ebb and flow of the number of justices in our early history, specifically at the beginning, we started at 6, identifying the detriment of having even number resulting in ties frequently, so we made it 7, ebbed and flowed a couple times. We'll talk about that progression next week. So we also see one of the powers of Congress is to determine naturalization and citizenship processes. You see in certain amendments this is addressed, but additionally you can see legislation passed by Congress to address this same thing. Last week we talked about an executive order signed by Barack Obama during his presidency heavily restricting immigration, and that was struck down as unconstitutional as it was a power granted primarily to Congress, and that was not a responsibility of the executive. So you saw the judicial branch, based on the ruling that this is a power of the legislative, strike down that executive order. And we see of course, the power we mentioned before, approval powers. The president may appoint individuals, federal judges and Supreme Court justices, cabinet members, great examples, but the Senate, with all of those individuals, must approve all appointments made with a simple majority. We saw these hearings for RFK Jr., because I just mentioned him, he's on top of my mind, Kristi Noem, and many other executive agency heads that resulted in them being approved by the Senate in recent months. We also see one of the most important and impactful powers granted to Congress is the power of the purse. They have the power and responsibility to impose taxes and tariffs, borrow funds, print currency, and regulate value, determine bankruptcy laws, and much more. Think of some of these means are actually we see the power of the purse being relied upon as a judicial interpretation to check executive power, as we remember Joe Biden's executive order using federal funds to forgive student loan debts, but that was an overreach of his executive powers based off the foundation that the power of the purse is granted to Congress, and they have the sole responsibility to impose taxes, tariffs, borrow funds, and address currency. So we see, in addition to this, there is some pushback currently with the executive orders revolving around certain tariffs, and we've seen the judicial branch push back the implementation dates for certain tariffs due to this foundation of our Constitution, stating that it was a power of Congress, not of the executive. But of course, we know, especially through last week's examination of executive orders by numerous presidents, this interpretation ebbs and flows with each generation and each national security threat. And we also see the president's ability to enact certain policies is determined afterwards by the judicial interpretation of those powers. So we are seeing some of these imposed tariffs being protected by the judicial branch, while others being struck down by the judicial branch, relying on Congress having the power of the purse. I used any of these examples just to help exemplify how you have certain judicial interpretations founded off of these constitutional powers granted to our Congress. So why do we have so many powers granted to Congress? Well, a lot of this is founded off of what is referred to as the elastic clause, also the necessary and proper clause. It states, quote, to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by the Constitution and the government of the United States or in any department or office thereof. This exclusively relates to Congress. I should have said that first part. The Congress shall have power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper. So this is a basis within our Constitution, within Section 1, providing the Article 1, providing the foundations of Congress and the legislative branch for the expanding powers of the national government. Also acts as a constituted check on the expansion of the presidential powers, specifically in the era of the New Deal, the 1930s. We used congressional powers to push back on the expanding role of the executive, as we see the EOP building up at that time, Executive Office of the President, and expanding the bureaucracy, building many positions within the bureaucracy, and expanding the powers of the cabinet as well. So we see at that time, we remember from last week, the 22nd Amendment, led by Congress, passed and ratified by Congress in the states, also restricted executive power. And we fast forward a bit, War Powers Resolution 1973, restricted executive power, expanding legislative power, all founded off of, on some part, off of the basis of the elastic clause. And it is very important to remember, the necessary and proper clause, also known as the elastic clause, specifically grants the federal legislature to have expanded powers to do whatever is necessary and proper to protect the nation. Specifically, the legislature, Congress. So let's look at these two bodies. Who leads the two bodies at large? We see the House of Representatives. Remember, that's the body with more representatives, that is more representative of the will of the general public. We have 435 members. Each of these members will serve 2-year terms. We will have the apportionment of representatives based on population, which was capped in 1929. We did have a temporary increase to 437 House of Representatives when Hawaii and Alaska became part of the United States in 1959, but evened out the following census year as we have Congress evaluate the census and distribution and apportionment of seats and the district maps every 10 years. Traditionally, as we've seen in recent months, some challenges to that legislative approach. But that's not a focus of today's lecture. So continuing on the House of Representatives, those are three primary points right at the beginning on top of this slide that will help identify differences between the House of Representatives and the Senate. And it is essential that you remember all three of them. And when asked on a quiz, what are two differences between the two bodies, you provide two of these reasonings and do not focus on the Senate being a cooler of any sorts. So we also see one of the highest positions, the highest position within our House of Representatives is the Speaker of the House. This is determined by the party with the majority of representatives within the House, who will then cast their votes to determine who their leader is. It is currently Mike Johnson, a Republican, leading in the position of the Speaker of the House. We also see majority and minority leaders. Less powerful positions, but we do see they relate to party votes. Also worth noting, the Speaker of the House and these minority and majority leaders were traditionally identified through seniority. It was the representative who had been in the House of Representatives for the longest would maintain these positions. During the 60s, 70s, roughly around then, there was a precedent and an approach to identifying these positions, which broke tradition of identifying the representative with seniority and instead identifying and voting for representatives with the most political sway or who can most accurately represent the middle of their party ideological spectrum. In recent few years ago, we saw after numerous votes, Mike Johnson coming in to be the Speaker of the House. And we also know that after each election, we have votes for new majority and minority leaders. In the Republican Party, Steve Scalise is currently the party leader elected by the majority party, and the minority leader is Democrat Hakeem Jeffries, elected by the, of course, minority party. And within the House of Representatives, both parties have numerous whips. These are aides to the majority and minority leaders of the House. What is their responsibility? A whip's responsibility is to whip the votes. They get as many votes as they can for certain legislation drafted and proposed by their political party, and will work across the ideological spectrum, but also in many instances primarily revolve around focusing on their political party. Whips in recent years, a Democratic whip would require gathering and whipping some Republican votes. A Republican in the current legislature would not have to do that, as they have a majority and enough to get a simple majority on most legislation. So the whips would be able to be party specific. So we understand these primary positions, their roles, leading the political parties, and we will look at the Speaker of the House in more detail. And now we'll examine the Speaker of the House. So Mike Johnson is the current Speaker of the House of Representatives. He's maintained this position since October 2023. I know, I just said we determine the representatives for the majority positions within the House of Representatives every election year. October, that is not an election year. 2023, not fitting with an election cycle. So he was actually voted into this position after a collective of Democratic and Republican House of Representatives ousted Kevin McCarthy for stating he was too middle of the road by some Republicans, and the reasoning for certain Democrats was it varied based on each representative. So we see after Kevin McCarthy was ousted from the position, Mike Johnson has maintained this position as Speaker of the House of Representatives since October 2023. I only mention that because, well, it helps you understand how he took the office and unusual event that has not traditionally happened in American history. This was, of course, a bit more fluent of a process in the past before we shifted in the 60s and 70s away from seniority positions, as the individual with the most seniority would have easily gotten this position and maintained it until an election cycle. But we, of course, have the Speaker of the House determined based off of party dynamics and preferences among elected representatives. So what is this position? What are the responsibilities of the Speaker of the House? So first off, before I say anything, it is worth noting that after the Vice President, the Speaker of the House is next in line for the presidency. Say there was an issue within a catastrophe has occurred and something happened to our President and Vice President, we would then have the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, step in and immediately act as the next president And then if something were to occur to Mike Johnson, it would be pro tempore. I think it's called pro tempore of the Senate. It's a silently voted upon senator who would, of course, coming from the majority party, who would represent, who would be the president if something were to happen to all three, president, vice president, and speaker of the House. But that will not be a question. Instead, it's important to remember that the speaker of the House is second or third in line, depending on how you would frame that, after the vice president to becoming the president. We would also see the Speaker of the House maintain this office if said we had an impeachment that identified guilty charges of both the president and vice president. But as we remember, no president has ever been removed from office due to the impeachment proceedings. So, what are the additional responsibilities of the Speaker of the House? They maintain strong influences over the House of Representatives. They determine and appoint members to select committees. Not all House committees does the Speaker of the House have the ability to appoint members to, but a large number. For one, we see House Rules Committee, House Intelligence Committee, and primarily the Steering and Policy Committees have direct influence from the Speaker of the House determining who their members are. And we will look at the role of committees in just a moment, as they play a primary role in the legislative process. If a bill cannot make it through a committee, a bill cannot get passed. So the Speaker of the House will also schedule legislation for floor action, for floor votes. They will determine what bills go to what committees to see what focuses will be examined in more detail. Say you have a bill that is proposed that sits at the intersection of two issues, say immigration and drug policies. Now, would the Speaker of the House send that bill to a committee focusing on immigration or a committee focusing on drug policies? The impact of debate would be significantly different based on which committee that bill is sent to. So, revealing significant power and the ability to progress or halt legislation or prioritize certain framing within legislation by setting it to certain committees. Additionally, they have the power to determine if it will be cast for a floor vote among the House of Representatives. We've seen in recent months some legislation, some bills being passed, gaining momentum, getting out of committee, but before they were cast to a vote on the House floor, the House convened and ended their session. So we will see various approaches to encouraging or discouraging certain legislation from reaching the House floor for action, which would be for a final vote within the House of Representatives. We also see a significant role in impeachment proceedings, as they will lead impeachment proceedings, making sure they follow rules of the House. Additionally, they interpret the rules of the House of Representatives. We do have rule books for the House and Senate determining certain precedents that House representatives and senators will maintain when acting within these bodies. So they will interpret those rules and enforce them as they lead hearings, specifically impeachment proceedings, for an example. This determines the rules regarding how representatives will debate each other on the House floor. They also have the ability, as I previously mentioned, to refer bills to appropriate standing committees. And additionally, I have mentioned they are second in line to become the president after the vice president. I yell out every time I give this lecture the importance of the Speaker of the House. This is often a position we do not acknowledge as average citizens. We do not focus on who the Speaker of the House will be, how our votes will impact the Speaker of the House. But we do have to recognize the immense influence the Speaker of the House has and direct relationship with the executive when we do look at national politics. So the Speaker of the House, an often undercredited, an overlooked position within our federal government, which has significant influence within the legislative process, the proceedings in the House, and the relationship with the executive branch. So I don't know why my formatting is different on the Senate there, but it is. So let's look at the Senate in more detail. This is the body which has equal distribution based on states. They are less organized than the House of Representatives, and they have 100 members representing this body. So equal representation, 100 members, less organized, and we see that the current leader of the Senate, known as the President of the Senate, is the Vice President, taking a lot of the powers of the Speaker of the House. Of course, not as many. We see the Vice President running the Senate in a sense. So we also have some additional party leadership positions. The Senate Majority Leader. This is the majority party that would elect a representative, just like the House would elect the majority party within the House would elect the Speaker of the House. The Senate Majority Leader is currently Republican John Thune. As we have a Republican majority in the Senate, we also have a Republican majority in the House of Representatives, and the executive branch is currently led by a Republican party. So we have a united government. We'll look at that later on, which only states that one party leads all branches of government. A divided government is quite routine in the United States, as we frequently have different parties representing each body and acting as checks on each other's party sentiments. So we also see the minority leader currently is Democrat Charles, known as Chuck, also referred to as Chuck Schumer. This is a representative of the minority party. These positions primarily are, well, they don't have as much hierarchical influence as, say, leadership positions within the House of Representatives, and they act similar to whips, trying to gather votes for their parties and maintaining some varying leadership responsibilities. They do have the power to set the agenda at times, appoint very select committee positions. This is far more restrictive than the powers given to the the Speaker of the House, and they of course manage general Senate business and processes that occur within the Senate. So if there is a tie within our Senate, 50 people vote one way and 50 people vote the other, the Vice President of the United States will act as the tie-breaking vote. We have seen this happen most presidencies, with policies varying, of course, oftentimes as a result of partisanship in the Senate. Now, let's look at the general differences between these two bodies. The House of Representatives is based off of population, has many local districts with very specific representation. They have 2-year terms, and we have 435 House of Representative members within this body. In contrast, the Senate, we have 2 senators for each state with equal proportion of every state. New Jersey went out, that little small state. They are chosen from the entire state, not specific districts, but the entire state, requiring that they appeal to a more broad population. We also see 6-year terms, expanded terms, as they are encouraged to not govern based off of ideology or emotion, and instead maintain the security of the agencies at large. We also see they make up, with equal proportionment among each state, 100 total members. When asked to identify the differences between these two bodies, this is how you must answer that question. I will not accept any other dimension or differences between the two bodies, as they are all more generally or theoretically examined than these objective, observable metrics of difference. And we do see throughout history, the way we elect these individuals has varied significantly. The House of Representatives was, of course, it's the people's body. They were originally elected by voters, while the Senate actually was elected by state legislatures and had a more of a check against the will of the general population. Of course, they are the saucer, the cooler to the House of Representatives, so this makes sense theoretically. But that was the practice for electing the senators, federal senators. They were elected by state legislatures until 1913, when that changed to allowing the popular vote to determine the senators. Of course, we remember theoretically the House follows more formal rules, while the Senate has more ability to have individual influences, while the House, of course, is far more and has to have more structure in order to have a cohesive body. Now, let's look at the lawmaking process at large. I identify 4 steps in the lawmaking process. We'll break that down in the next slide. But when we look at this process at large, we know that this is a process, a task granted to our legislative branch. Legislation, they are tasked with drafting legislation. It's in the name. So representatives should defend the interests of their home district, constituent, state, and entire nation when acting in the lawmaking process. There are 4 steps: proposal, committee, vote within both bodies, and then presidential approval. We will look at those again in just a moment. Some important terms to understand when discussing the lawmaking process include earmarks. These are provisions in legislation to fund separate projects. They were actually banned during the 2010s for about 10 years, but brought back and shown to be more effective in encouraging bipartisan legislation. So, earmarks, provisions in legislation to fund separate projects. Think of it as, say we wanted to implement funding for Republican legislation to fund a border wall. But in order to get some Democratic votes who may not prioritize the focus of a border wall, they would say we will include an earmark to provide funding for a Democratic policy position, to provide funding for housing subsidies in urban areas or something of that nature. So an earmark can expand funding to include funding additional projects to encourage other representatives to align. This was banned due to the sentiment that it encouraged backroom dealing among elite representatives that would distance them from the interests of their constituents. But as we banned these dimensions of legislative of the lawmaking process, we saw that it resulted in far more partisanship within the legislative branch. What do I mean by partisanship? Well, when I say bipartisanship, I mean when legislative action is backed by both political parties or representatives of the political parties work across the ideological aisle. So bipartisanship in recent years, as we remember from last lecture, well, 2 lectures ago actually, has gone down roughly 30% since 1989. So we see bipartisanship, the lack of bipartisanship encouraging the revival of earmarks, which increase the incentive for passing legislation. Now, when we pass legislation, it is important that we understand this word we hear on the news all the time, a quorum. We understand that representatives are going to work to pass legislation, and they have to physically be at work to pass the legislation, and people have varying schedules. These representatives come from their specific states and they have to travel to DC to enact legislation. They also have to make sure they stay in their home districts long enough to ensure they understand the interests of their home constituents. So we do not always have all representatives on the House or Senate floor when determining certain legislation, and they do not always have the ability to cast their vote. And that is why we need a quorum to consider any legislation. This is where we have a majority of representatives present to conduct business. So stating we do not have to have all representatives present, but a simple majority, a quorum, apologies, to be able to debate and pass legislation. How a bill becomes a law up on Capitol Hill. So we have the 4 steps provided right here. First, we propose legislation. Any member of Congress can do so. In the House or the Senate, legislation can start from either body. And then after a bill is proposed, we see very quickly the leader of the body in which it was proposed will determine which committees this bill will be heard in. We see in the Senate there are 17 Senate committees with 70 subcommittees. And these, of course, address very specific and wide-ranging issues from immigration, drug enforcement, various interests, all specific interests you can identify. There is a committee addressing these interests. We see the 17 Senate, 70 subcommittees in the Senate, 23 House committees with 104 subcommittees, of course, represented there with more organization and structure in the House of Representatives as we have more representatives. So the second step, the Speaker of the House or the Majority Leader in the Senate will refer the bill to the appropriate committee. Then, once it has made it through committee, where we have a closed room debate on the legislation and the merits and detriments of specific dimensions of this legislation, oftentimes seeing critiques and reworkings, and we see that once it is passed through the committee process, of course, through a vote, a majority vote within the committee, it is then referred to whatever the general floor of the House or the Senate for overall voting. Now, say a bill is proposed in the House of Representatives. Rewinding a bit. First step, a House of Representatives proposes it. Second step, House of Representative Committee. Third step, it's voted on by the entire House of Representatives. If it passes, that third step continues, and we will see it continue to the Senate, and they will vote in the Senate for a simple majority, and if it passes in the Senate, it will go to the final step. So that third step, a bit detailed, a bit more nuanced. I generalized it because if you Google it, I will know. So the fourth step is after it is passed by the House and the Senate, it is brought to the president's desk for consideration, and this is where they can send it into law, or as you remember from last week, veto it in one of two ways: regular or pocket veto, the more silent approach. So the 4 steps to proposing and implementing legislation, clearly provided here, and will likely be asked on a quiz. Spacebar. All right. So, additional, what are congressional immunities? We've probably heard this here and there on national news. Well, this is the reality that representatives are immune from arrest while attending sessions and while traveling to and from those sessions. Think of it this way. Remember, we needed that quorum, a majority of representatives present to hear legislation. So what if a representative had friends in the police department and they were able to pull over representatives that do not align with their ideological interests and they know are likely to vote in opposition to their legislation? Well, we have representative immunities, so this cannot happen. So we cannot have representatives stalled and prevented from reaching Congress to cast their votes. So we see immunities from arrest while attending sessions and traveling to and from those sessions. So look at the text of our Constitution directly. It says, quote, freedom of speech and debate in Congress shall not be impeached or questioned in any court or placed out of Congress. And the members of Congress shall be protected in their persons from arrest and imprisonment during the time of their going to and from and attendance on Congress, except for treason, felony, or breach of the peace. So, end quote. And we see there a couple things. So for one, members of Congress are protected while on the floor. So they are protected from speech and from regulations of their speech while debating certain legislation. A congressman is legally able to say, Shell Company is harming the population in this way, even if there is no founded truth to that claim, as we need to protect our congressional representatives from being restricted in their use of speech when debating legislation. This needs to be a protected entity. In addition, you cannot pull congressional representatives over, preventing them from reaching Congress and voting when there is a more productive quorum for the pro-legislative party. So we see these general protections and immunities for congressional representatives, but they do not protect you from treason, felony, or breach of the peace. So you may be able to speed a bit down that highway to make sure you get to Congress, but you may not do so in a sense where you're shooting out the window to tell people to pull over. That would be a felony and breach of the peace. Of course, you cannot also commit treason. So there are restrictions to congressional immunities, although there are protections for representatives when on Congress and on their way to and from Congress. Now, I probably should have mentioned this a little earlier, but congressional committees. We mentioned these briefly in the legislative process, the second step, and this is where bills are truly debated. Committees are tailored to address specific issues. I mentioned before some examples, but think of agriculture, armed services, small business, budget, so much more. They can investigate issues of governance or the applications of legislation through oversight. This is where you see the starting point of a lot of oversight hearings and oversight committees at large. There is a committee on oversight and accountability that has the main responsibility within the House of Representatives to ensuring that all legislation is implemented effectively. So we see that beyond being able to debate policies and bills in detail without scrutiny of public or the press, we see that committees also maintain oversight responsibilities in ensuring that legislation is adequately enforced. This is the ideal environment for bipartisan discussion, as we have committees with almost always neutral or even representation among each political party, or at least we maintain the general approach and aim at that. And in these committees, legislation is adequately debated, and then these committees can also be mobilized to enforce oversight hearings. And worth noting, committee hearings, they oftentimes will pull in experts and representatives and members of the bureaucracy and scrutinize them or ask for their expertise and intelligence regarding certain issues. So, continuing the discussion regarding the legislative branch, let's look at one of the tools utilized for minority representatives within exclusively the Senate. Also, some would refer to it as a primary tool of obstruction. So this is referred to as the filibuster. This is the Senate tradition in which enables any single representative to expand unlimited debate. This is in recent years used as a delay tactic to block bills or legislation or nominees. We see this reached a peak in usage during the presidency of Barack Obama regarding federal judge positions and during various other periods in U.S. history like civil rights era. So again, the filibuster means one representative only available for the Senate. One representative can say this bill has not been adequately debated and I refuse to let anyone vote on it, and I have more to say. Traditionally, a filibuster allowed them to take the floor and continue talking until they physically can't anymore. We see some of the longest filibusters going over 24 hours of constant debate. Yes, a representative standing on the Senate floor for 24 plus hours debating legislation before we can cast a vote on it. This could result in other representatives going home, resulting in a shift in the quorum present, resulting in a shift in the resulted votes later on. So this debate process, we've seen Strom Thurmond maintain the longest official filibuster. I think it was 24 hours and like 18 minutes or something like that, as he filibustered civil rights legislation in the 1950s. Of course, that legislation did eventually get passed, but he did successfully filibuster that bill at that time, resulting in the revival of the legislation in a later session for it to ever be passed. So, successful use of the filibuster has halted legislation at various points. We also see the 1970s, a filibuster was utilized in the Senate to restrict to discourage the implementation of a bill abolishing the Electoral College, even though there was general popular support at about 80% polled by Gallup. So some other terms regarding the filibuster process include cloture, reconciliation, and the nuclear option. You've heard of the nuclear option, but probably not much about cloture and reconciliation. So cloture, also referred to as Rule 22, this is where debate will end in the Senate if 16 senators sign a petition requesting it and 3/5, 60 senators at large, so a supermajority, vote for it. Each senator can then speak for a max of 1 hour and then they must cast a final vote. So cloture, basically stating if you have 3/5 majority, a supermajority of 60 senators among the 100 who agree that we just want to vote, then you can end the filibustered debate. Additionally, we can see the term reconciliation. This is a dimension in which our budget bills are protected from use of the filibuster because we need to have budget bills efficiently passed. So we restrict our ability to filibuster certain budget bills through reconciliation. The House can send a budget bill to Congress with rules specifying that it cannot be filibustered. This is first determined within the House, but then once it reaches the Senate may not filibuster. And the nuclear option. This is changing the rules of certain legislation to abolish the need for a supermajority and requiring that you need a simple majority to vote in the Senate. This tool has been utilized and implemented when considering federal judges and Supreme Court justices since the year of roughly 2000, and we'll look at that development over time, as the nuclear option has been utilized two times in recent history. So let's look at the history of this filibuster. Again, only present in the Senate, a tool only present and available for senators, those 100 elected representatives. It is not in our Constitution and was not a part of our founding fathers' vision. According to a study conducted by political scientists Sarah Binder and Stephen Smith, of the 30 measures that historically were derailed by the filibuster usage between the years 1917 and 1994, exactly half of them revolved around the issues of civil rights. So we see the filibuster being utilized and mobilized in excessive use regarding civil rights legislation. And we see throughout the past, we see some senators calling against the filibuster. Former Senator Alan Frumin stated, quote, "During my tenure, contained within the Senate was a critical mass of responsible adults, cobbled from both parties who understood that, yes, we can filibuster, but they exercised restraint." Continuing on, that critical mass of responsible adults has been replaced by a growing caucus of petulant infants, end quote, representing the sentiment that the development of the filibuster over time has eroded its effectiveness and use to ensure minority protections within the legislative process. We also rewind a bit and we can thank good old Aaron Burr. Remember the individual who shot and killed Alexander Hamilton while acting as Vice President of the United States? Yes, that happened. Our Vice President shot and killed a man in a duel. That man being Alexander Hamilton, one of the founding fathers. Well, Aaron Burr and John Calhoun are the reason we have the filibuster. Burr pushed for less rules in the Senate rulebook in 1806, right after being acquitted for killing our boy on Broadway, Alexander Hamilton. And this resulted in the abolishing of a rule that ended debates. This continued on without being taken advantage of until later on when John Calhoun took advantage of this rule change and started doing what we refer to today as the filibuster, stating that the debate has not ended and we must continue discussing. So we see the word filibuster, worth noting, comes from a Dutch word for pirate. Some would refer to it as stealing the floor, and that's why we see the relationship with the Dutch origins. We also see in recent years President Barack Obama in a eulogy for Congressman and civil rights activist John Lewis. We see John Lewis standing on March on Selma alongside Martin Luther King in many historic photos, passed away a few years ago. After being a representative within our Congress for many, many years. The filibuster is, we see Barack Obama at this eulogy stating that the filibuster is, quote, a Jim Crow relic, identifying the sentiment that many have examined that this has been primarily utilized to halt civil rights legislation in U.S. history, as identified by previously mentioned political scientists. Now, of course, we do have to remember that this was intended to strengthen the powers of minority groups within Congress, often, and we do know, often utilized to halt legislation that was supported by majorities. Now, when we look at the recent history of the filibuster, we see there was a couple eras in which it peaked, two in particular. The 1900s era that was examined by those political scientists, focusing on civil rights legislation. As we saw, it was utilized to halt civil rights legislation half of the time. But again, in the heightened political polarization era, the era that has resulted in a lack of bipartisanship, as we again previously mentioned. So what do I mean by these two eras? We mentioned briefly the civil rights era and the heightened use during the 1900s, represented by the longest filibuster in U.S. history, led by Strom Thurmond at 24 hours and some minutes. I want to say 18 minutes, but it doesn't matter. We also had the longest Senate speech provided by Cory Booker just a few months ago, but I do not believe it was an official filibuster, so it did not actually break the record implemented by Strom Thurmond. And we do see in recent years there were 82, and this is why we see the use of the first nuclear option. In 2008, during the presidency of Barack Obama, there were 86 filibusters on judicial nominations. These are the nominations provided by Barack Obama to maintain federal judge positions. Prior to Barack Obama's term as president, in all of U.S. history, there were a combined 82 filibusters on judicial nominations. So we saw more filibusters on judicial nominations during a single two-term presidency than our entire U.S. history. This significantly delayed our judicial branch's ability to have federal court hearings and procedures and delayed the right to a speedy trial for many citizens within the United States. This mobilized Harry Reid to utilize what is referred to as the nuclear option on judicial appointments, excluding the Supreme Court, and this was done in 2013. So in 2013, Harry Reid called the nuclear option. We now only need a simple majority to end a debate. We need cloture at 51 over 60 representatives. So lowering the threshold for getting to a final vote for federal judges. This expedited the judicial nomination process, resulting in many federal judges reaching a final vote, being struck down or approved by the Senate. And we do see later on, led by Senator Mitch McConnell, the use of the nuclear option once again, but this time specifically for Supreme Court nominations, as we saw the delays in the nomination and the approval process regarding some of Donald Trump's early in his first presidency, early Supreme Court justice nominations, utilizing the nuclear option, only requiring a simple majority, allowing for those nominees to be progressed forward and now act as 3 of the current 9 Supreme Court justices. Now, who makes up the Electoral College? We mentioned this prior when we talked about electing the president, but we didn't look at it in too much detail. And I know we're talking about the legislative branch. Why are we talking about how we elect the executive? Well, we do this because the Electoral College is determined based off the number of national representatives, based off of the number of congressmen and women within our federal government. So the Electoral College consists of 538 representatives from all 50 states and additional representatives to be included in for representing Washington, D.C. So that is why it's not exactly equal to what you, if you did the math regarding the amount of House representatives and senators, as we have 3 additional seats for 3 Electoral College votes in Washington, D.C. So the number of the Electoral College votes is equal to the number of national representatives in the state. So each state is granted 2 Electoral College votes due to their senators and additional votes based off of how many representatives they have in the House of Representatives. Montana, in the most recent consensus, expanded the number of House of Representative members, and now we have 4 total Electoral College votes. So when we look at the Electoral College at large, this is utilized to be a check on the general population's popular vote. And when you utilize the Electoral College, it is the first candidate to obtain 270, a simple majority of Electoral College votes, of the 538 votes to win the presidency. Electors in the Electoral College cannot be sitting representatives, and that is worth noting. And we will look at the electoral process in more detail later on, as I previously mentioned. But we do see the delegates through this process are appointed by parties prior to the election. Some parties obtaining the majority of the presidential vote get to appoint their leaders. We see, the party obtaining the majority of the presidential vote gets to appoint their leaders. That is their primary candidate. And we do also see, and we will look at this in detail, and I won't expect you to remember this yet, but 2 states do not have winner-takes-all electoral systems, and they are Nebraska and Maine, in which they divide their Electoral College votes based on the proportion of candidates obtaining them. So we see the method for selecting electors varies significantly by state. Some states hold convention, choose their electors, while others allow the party central committees to elect them. So nuance and diversity, as we see represented by the state level executive and state level legislatures, a lot of nuance between each state. Now, the final concluding point in today's lecture: what are the current checks that the other branches have on the powers of the legislative? So first, judicial. There's one check that judicial has on both bodies, and it is quite effective and does not require much expansion. And that is that the judicial determines the constitutionality of legislative decisions through their rulings, exclusively being able to cite our Constitution and statutory laws. So, judicial branch, say you have a law passed by Congress. Throughout U.S. history, we have Jim Crow laws and black codes that were legislation passed by our legislative bodies on the state and federal level that restricted the access for minority groups to work certain jobs, create economic independence, and vote without restrictions. Though that legislation was ruled in Brown v. Board of Education and additional judicial rulings thereafter that they are unconstitutional and that they must provide certain protections for all individuals, striking down past legislation, acting as a check on the legislative branch by the judicial through those landmark rulings regarding civil rights and liberties. How can the executive act on a check on the legislative, though? Remember, we have expanded the powers of the executive primarily during the 1930s to address an unruly legislative branch that does not accurately represent the general public. So the executive can veto legislation. If legislation is passed that does not represent the interests of the president or the general public or certain collectives' interests, they can veto it, as we previously mentioned. We also see presidents can make treaties and sign executive orders. They can determine how certain legislation will be implemented through executive orders. They can change the guidelines for the legislature through these actions, and they can make the treaties that the Senate must then approve or disapprove, creating the spark for the treaty process that will later be picked up by the legislative branch. And additionally, president can call special sessions into Congress. They can call Congress to reconvene in order to address specific issues like a national security threat that may occur at a specific unpredicted time. Think of things like COVID or 9/11, call in Congress for a special session to immediately deal with some emergency legislation, or you can have examples where a special session is called in to address a specific issue that is favored by the political party at large. We've seen that in recent years and throughout US history. What did we learn? Here are some questions. Answer them. And if you can't, here are your answers. Make sure they're right. And what's due? Discussions, as always, some weekly readings, and just make sure you take this easier week to relax, breathe, and make sure you understand what's happening in this course. Are you understanding what I'm saying when I yell at you in these lectures? Do you need me to have a Zoom one-on-one to help you understand it in more depth? Are you understanding the concepts that we cover that might relate to your paper later on? And if not, do you want to learn them in more detail? Set up a Zoom with me and I will ramble on and make sure you understand what I'm saying. And I want to get to know you guys. So reach out. Let me see if I can help you any way possible. Thank you guys. Have a great rest of your day.